Engineer is a tower that is earned through purchasing with the use of gems, a currency obtained through hardcore. Of course, since it is a hardcore tower, it has to be expensive, roughly 1.8 times the price of the accelerator, which is close to 2 times. And that's quite a lot. The accelerator already costs a buttload of gems to get, and on top of that, it's another tower? It's an incredibly painful and an extremely time-consuming task that few people accomplish to get the tower. However, with many of these problems, it could just be solved with Robux. But I had to purchase the engineer the real way, aka spending over 15 hours on the freaking game mode grinding gems endlessly for basically 3 days straight. Of course, at the end, I was still kind of sane, but enough of me, let's talk about the actual tower itself and see if it's really worth the pain and effort that I and probably some of you had to go through to obtain the tower itself. Before we get to how you can actually use the engineer, let's talk about the upgrades first. In this very specific case, the engineer actually has 6 different upgrades. The first tower I think to have 6 upgrades, so that's pretty cool. So let's start with level 0. Level 0 is basically when you place the engineer down. In this quote-unquote first level, the engineer does 3 damage and the sentry does 1 damage. Incredibly, even though the engineer looks to have a shotgun, she still has quite a huge range, so I don't know. It costs $750 to place her, which is quite damn cheap, and she can be used for early game quite sustainably with a cheap price. Another thing is that the sentry costs 10 scrap. I'll talk about the scrap thing later on. I promise it's important. For the actual first level, we get an increase of the engineer's damage by 2 and more range to the engineer overall. Not the sentry itself, just the engineer. Next level for the engineer gains 1 extra range, less dead zone range, which I will explain that later on as well, hidden detection, and flying detection. Not gonna lie, after reading the wiki page of the engineer, she's kind of really useful for hardcore as well. Because of its cheap price and the ability to detect 2 of the most annoying zombies in hardcore, it's quite handy to have the engineer in your party when trying to triumph hardcore. Although that is if you're playing hardcore, which I am not, so I don't know. For the third level, the engineer gains 5 extra damage, but the main thing you'll want from this upgrade is the sentry. The sentry upgrades from your puny level 1 to a level 15 rifle sentry. A good upgrade, increasing the fire rate of your sentry by half and increasing the damage by an extra 1. And for the next upgrade, the engineer gains another 5 extra damage, 3 extra range, and lowers its fire rate. Additionally, it also gives the sentries a defensive shield which can deflect stuns or attacks from other mobs such as boomers and or hardcore mobs that I cannot show since I have skill issue and cannot reach those waves. The shields will always be penetrated by bosses if I remember, so yeah, that's sad. Also, you can place another extra sentry from the upgrade, which is always welcome. For one of the big upgrades, aka level 5, it's quite good, not gonna lie. The engineer gains 10 extra damage now, another extra sentry placement, and more importantly, the sentry upgrade. It goes from the level 15 rifle sentry to a Chad level 50 minigunner sentry, being able to dish out basically the same amount of damage as a normal minigunner would, but it's replaceable and it doesn't count as a tower placement, as well as it kind of can be stunned as well, so it's pretty nice. And finally, for the last upgrade, the engineer gains even more damage of gaining an extra 15 plus damage, 2 extra range, decreasing the dead zone range once again, and lowering the engineer's fire rate even more. But the most important part of this upgrade is the sentry upgrade once again. It turns from the level 50 Chad sentry to the level 99 Giga Chad of metal. It's basically a separate tower by this point, and the sentries themselves do quite a lot of damage. Apparently, it's around like 250 DPS. It's from this guy's comment, and that's the engineer's DPS somehow, so that's pretty cool. So yeah, the accelerator does have more DPS in total, but I mean, the engineer is like a second accelerator to me, so yeah. And that's about all the upgrades the engineer has in store for her. Maybe there will be some nerfs to her or even buffs, but I mean, I don't really care. Just look at the wiki if you're that start for information. But since we're done with the upgrades, let's talk about the unique attributes of the engineer. The engineer has 2 unique attributes that separates the tower itself from other towers, that being the scrap meter and the 3 circles. Now, as I mentioned before, the engineer has these dead zone ranges. It's actually just a red circle, so I'll just call it that. There are actually 3 circles for the engineer, which is pretty cool, not gonna lie. These 3 circles is what kind of separates the engineer as being a unique tower in itself. The first circle, aka the red circle or the dead zone circle or whatever the hell you call it, is where the engineer can't do anything, and I mean anything to anything at all. That being building sentries, doing damage to zombies. Well, that's it, but still. Engineer is not really built to be a close-range tower, unlike Shotgunner, for example, so just don't put the engineer like near corners and stuff. Use it like how you'd use a pursuit, for example, since if it's too close, it won't be able to do quite literally anything. The second circle is where the engineer can actually build the sentries. That's why you don't see the sentries built around the map scattered like puzzle pieces. The good thing about this circle is that it actually doesn't come into contact to tower placements as well, so you can just put any tower in the sentry somehow and it'll work out. The circle is just the limit to how far the engineer can place the sentries. That's it. The third circle is probably already clear to begin with. It's the engineer's range. If you didn't know that, then you're kind of stupid. The more upgrades the engineer's range gets, the bigger it gets. Pretty simple, am I right? Now onto the scrap meter. The scrap meter is basically how much damage the engineer needs to output to be able to quote quote-unquote build the sentries per se. Now for example, let's take the war machine sentry. It costs 100 scrap to be able to build one of these sentries. And now you might be asking, how do you get scrap in the first place? Well, to get scrap, you just need to do damage from the engineer. Yeah, it's not that hard. Just let your engineer do its thing, and sooner or later the scrap meter will be maxed and your engineer will build one of your many sentries. I forgot to mention that these sentries have differing amounts of scrap. The first one costs 10, the rifle sentry costs 20, the minigunner sentry costing 50, and as I mentioned before, the war machine sentry costing 100. It differs from the upgrades your engineers are in, and it's a good way to kind of balance the sentries, I guess. And with that, I'm going to be talking about the engineer just as my opinion now, so you can take it with a grain of salt if you want. The engineer in itself is a pretty damn good tower. With its DPS alone, it builds an alright unit. However, if we take account to these sentries as well, the engineer is an amazing tower, almost as good as the accelerator, if not better in some situations altogether. With the ability to have the sentries constantly spew out DPS from the good old addition of its shield, it's quite amazing to be honest. I'm pretty sure that the engineer is the second or is the best tower, but it really depends. Also, I'm not the one to judge since I don't research these topics thoroughly. But hey, let's chill about the damage first and talk about the time and the patience you must have to actually obtain the tower in the first place. The amount of determination and willpower you need to actually get enough gems to purchase her is quite a lot. You might be able to touch grass, take a breath of fresh air or something instead of mindlessly doing the same monotonous task. Of course, saying this, I am kind of a hypocrite since I don't go outside and I made an entire video about the process of obtaining this stupid tower, but still. Of course, many of you have some brain power and actually just bought the tower itself using Robux, and like, that is a smart move, but fuck you. So for this tower's description, yeah, it's worth it. If you want to spend a buttload of time and energy into doing the same task for hours on end, you have a better chance at finding a job, working there, buying the Robux, and then getting the engineer. But once you do get her, she's a pretty damn good tower. Of course, there can be alternatives here and there, like maybe the accelerator, golden minigunner, and turret. And I also forgot to mention how good she is in hardcore, but I don't play hardcore, so yeah, I don't care about that. Alright, now go destroy that subscribe button, and I am Utsi. I'll be hibernating once again. Bye bye.